Game over, man. Game over.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
So serious.
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the InSession Film Podcast.
Welcome to episode 627 for March 10th, 2025, and I'm JD Duran.
And I'm Brendan Cassidy.
Hey, thanks for joining us, everybody. It is going to be a really, really fun show, but before we get into it, I just want to say a happy birthday to my mom.
Oh,
whose
happy birthday, Mrs.
is
Duran.
today as we are recording this. It's very, very exciting. So I just wanted to shout out my mom, who I love.
Good man, and a good mom. Yep, she obviously gave birth to not just one, but three great children, right? So, so let's call out everyone there.
God love her. Yeah, I do love my brother and sister as well. March is a big birthday month for my family back home.
Oh yeah,
there's a lot of March birthdays. So I
That's
guess
actually
happy
the same
birthday
case
to
here.
the whole Duran Shackelford clan.
Yeah, it's actually the same case. The same case here. My dad's birthday was the 7th, so happy birthday to my dad. And then my sister's birthday is the 16th, which is also coincidentally my wife's mom's birthday, which was a very interesting kind of serendipitous connection when we first started getting to know each other. It's like, hey, we have some similar birthdays kind of lining up here.
Well, there you go. It's a big Cassidy Duran birthday month, so that's
I guess
exciting.
March is our month now going forward.
Yeah. Happy birthday to everybody involved. See, I did want to shout out my mom there. I do want to welcome everybody in. I don't know if we have any new listeners from this last week, but I did want to call them out as well, because I did have some people reach out to me on social media because of a tweet that I had sent out, and also unrelated to After Sun, simply because of the Best Picture movie series. We've had some comments on YouTube as well that people have subscribed to the show and have loved that series. So if you're a new listener as a result of that, welcome to InSession Film. We're glad to have you, no matter whether you're a new listener within the last week or so, or if you've been with us for 11 years.
You're a newbie or an oldie, we love you regardless.
We love you regardless.
We should be doing welcome messages like that more often. I think that needs to become kind of the norm.
Yes. Yeah. Subscribe to the show if you haven't already. We really do appreciate your support by subscribing to the show. And if you want to go even further, you can become an InSession Film VIP, where we have some bonus content via Patreon, via membership of the InSession Film YouTube channel. You can become a member on our YouTube channel, or you can sign up via Apple Podcast subscriptions.
Yep.
Either way, that gets you access to all of our VIP bonus content. So we really do appreciate those that are tuning in, either through the main episodes or through VIP, however you want to tune in and join us. We really do appreciate it. This week's show is going to be a lot of fun. We have a lot to get into. The first half of the show, we are using the prompt where I, had my little moment there with After Sun.
JD went viral. JD went viral for, I guess, was it really viral? I mean, what constitutes as viral these days? What are the statistics?
I don't know.
It did well. It did well, so I don't know if viral is the right word, though.
Yeah, it got a lot of attention, and I don't want to say attention, but it got certainly plenty of feedback and engagement.
Yeah.
I guess is the word I was really going for there, which was very exciting. A lot of people seem to agree with me about After Sun. A lot of After Sun fans found the tweet and we're very excited to respond.
It's a good movie.
And we're going to use that as inspiration for the first half of the episode. We're going to talk about the best shots of the decade so far. And this is a good little appetizer for our best of the decade so far. I don't want to say awards, but we're going to have a show coming in a few months where we're going to talk about the best films of the decade so far. And this is a nice little appetizer kind of leading into that.
Sure.
So we're going to talk about the best shot film, or the best shots of the 2020 so far. And we're also kind of pairing this with my after Sun essay. I did go ahead and write that essay, even
Already?
though
Good for you.
I did send that tweet innocuously, not really planning on doing said essay.
But then it's like, I'm feeling it.
Well,
right?
It wasn't even so much that as much as there were a lot of people in the comments going, no, you should write that. There was a lot of encouragement of, no, we would love to read it. And I was like, okay. And because it wasn't just one or two people, I probably got a couple dozen comments like that.
Which is awesome to see.
Right.
Yeah, that's really awesome to see, because I feel like something that happens more often than not on the internet is people telling other people to do things. But in this case, it seemed like people genuinely were curious about what words you had to say on the subject, which was really cool.
Which was very exciting. Honestly, it was very, very exciting. So when you're getting positive encouragement, which is not something you see on social media ever.
It's not something you ever see on film Twitter. It's like what happened? What portal did we walk through?
I know. I was getting some positive encouragement and I felt inspired. So over the weekend, I did get a chance to write that essay. God bless Dave Giannini, who earlier today helped me edit that piece and refine it a little bit. So it is ready. In fact, by the time this episode goes live, that essay will probably be live on our website at InSessionFilm.com. So you can go and check that out. And we're going to pair them together. That essay, it's live, it's available. And with this episode, using that again as inspiration, we're going to talk about the best shots of the decade so far. And in the back half of this show, we are, of course, going to continue our Best Picture movie series as we get into the year, 1962.
1962, that is correct.
Lawrence of Arabia, little film called Lawrence of Arabia.
Well,
I don't know if you've heard of it, but...
Yeah, I haven't heard of it. I guess I have to talk about it on this episode, though, so good luck to me. But I guess that is very appropriate, right, JD, that we're talking about in the first half of this episode some of the best shots of the decade so far, and we're pairing that topic with arguably one of the best shot movies of all time.
Yeah,
so I guess it kind of makes sense.
Yeah, it very much makes sense. It all aligned perfectly. It was really, really good. We did that on purpose. Just like for our reviews this week, we're talking about Mickey 17, and we're also talking about a little film called Love Me. Both of those films star Stephen Yeun, and the co-stars in both of those films, one of them is, of course, Robert Pattinson. The co-star of Love Me is one Kristen Stewart. Totally did that on purpose.
Absolutely.
We, of course, aligned that where Stephen Yeun did the whole Pattinson-Stewart combo. That was no coincidence. We, of course, had that in mind, just like we had this in mind. Gonna pretend. Gotta pretend.
We like to think ahead. We like to think ahead with some of these things.
Exactly. Lawrence of Arabia, one of the best shot films of all time. No doubt about that.
Absolutely.
Before we get to Lawrence of Arabia, though, let's go ahead and dive into the 2020s. Let's talk about this decade so far. We've had 5 years of film in this decade, which is crazy. Hard to believe that is the case.
I feel old.
I know.
5 years ago was when COVID hit and the world lockdown. It doesn't feel like that.
2023 was wild to me because that was our 10-year anniversary as a show.
Absolutely.
2013 was the first year film that we covered here at InSession Film. So you get to 2023 and you go throughout that whole year and you're reminiscing on all the films that came out in 2013 that celebrated a 10-year anniversary. We are now 2 years past that.
Yeah.
We're now to 2025, which is crazy. I just don't know where the time goes.
This decade is halfway over almost.
Yeah. Mad Max Fury Road is going to have its 10-year anniversary in 2 months' time.
To think of it this way, those who were born the same year that Mad Max Fury Road came out can now speak in complete sentences.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah,
absolutely insane. I don't know where the time goes. But yeah, the 2020s, we're halfway there. Let's talk about some of the best shots of the decade so far. I guess I will simply start with After Sun because that is
basically
so much of the inspiration here.
Yeah.
Again, I encourage you to go and check out that piece that I wrote at InSessionFilm.com. I go into it, obviously, in some great detail there.
Yeah.
But short of it here, I think what I really love about this scene, for me, it is the nucleus of the movie, right?
Oh, yeah.
Where so much of the movie is about memory. The foundation of the film, the format is structured through an older Sophie who was watching her home videos, reminiscing on this vacation with her father. So much of that sequence, or so much of the whole film, is about memory and looking back. And you get to that whole tell scene, and Charlotte Wells, of course, wonderfully, impeccably foreshadows what is about to come through some great cinematography and visual symbolism kind of leading to it. But what I love about that scene is, or that shot particularly, and again, to emphasize, it is a stationary shot, somewhat of a low angle shot, looking up at the TV that is there on the counter. You have some books kind of next to the TV, and through the glass on the TV, the reflection, you're able to see Sophie and Callum there in the reflection as they're sitting on the bed having a conversation. And while that whole sequence starts off endearing and charming, this wonderful father-daughter moment, it quickly becomes profound when Sophie asks Callum about his 11th birthday, and he tells this absolutely devastating story about no one remembering that it was his 11th birthday. And it connects you deeper to his melancholy and his despondency that we see throughout that film. And I just found the symbolism, the use of reflection, literal, pragmatic reflection off the TV screen, that as a cipher for the film's themes and pathos, I think is astounding. Absolutely astounding.
Yeah.
The nuances and the mechanics, the layers of that whole sequence, it blows my mind. It comes from a first-time filmmaker. It's incredible.
How much of that were you reading from your essay that you wrote?
Honestly, I was going off of memory there.
Good job. Good job.
Funny enough, I was
going to say, is this our
even looking at my
dissertation with
notes.
JD Duran right now?
I wasn't even looking at my notes. I was just going off of everything that I'd written over the weekend there.
I guess, if anything, it's a good precursor for some of the content that'll be within that essay, because a lot of what you're talking about, I think, is certainly apt, and what makes that shot so great. It's not just the symbolism of it, for sure, but it also gets into something that I feel like most movies, especially big movies these days, just can't seem to ever do anymore, and that's properly balance simplistic shots. If you just look at that shot from this movie After Sun and you take away the symbolic importance of it, which I don't recommend you do, you still have a very well balanced and beautifully staged shot that has sometimes 3 different meanings happening simultaneously. And that takes maybe even more skill than a shot that's very mobile, because we're going to talk about a lot of different shots that might be a bit more, let's just say, active as far as
kinetic.
The camera work is. The camera moves a bit more, because a stationary shot is one thing, but I think also the way a shot moves is a very different thing. We'll talk about both examples here, but sometimes a shot that's stationary that has even more to say might be arguably harder to pull off. And I think this is a great example of that.
Yeah, it goes back to a dichotomy we've talked about before as it relates to acting. And I feel like it sounds cynical a lot of the time when we're having this debate, where I don't always love capital A acting. Sometimes it is fantastic and it is called for, depending on the movie and the scene. But I love subtlety. I think it is harder to pull off. And I think the same thing can be applied to cinematography at times. Now, the sophistication of a moving camera with, tethered to choreography within the scene, that can be extravagant. Don't get me wrong. I think the technical craftsmanship that goes into a moving shot is, there's nuances there for sure.
There's merit to it when it's needed.
But on the same token, when the camera is moving in this big bombastic way, it tends to be more noticeable. Whereas a shot like this is, I think sometimes it's easy to overlook because it's just a stationary camera for an extended period of time. It's a couple of minutes at the very least, just pointed at this TV in this hotel. That's all it's doing for about 2 minutes.
Yeah.
And it doesn't move. Like Charlotte Wells does not cut during that shot. And it is phenomenal, as I noted, the profundity that comes about because of it almost feels like it shouldn't work because it's so simple, and yet the sophistication that comes about because of the layers she builds into it is quite incredible. But
it's also well balanced.
It speaks to me. Yeah,
but it's also well balanced. Just the shot itself, I think, is well staged because you have things layered on top of each other rightfully. So it actually looks like you're looking at something that your eyes want to go dead center to that shot. It doesn't feel like it's weighted differently in a certain corner or a certain segment of the frame, which is where I think the artfulness of that shot comes into play, and the physicality of it, but also the symbolic nature of it, I think adds more to it. So when you go back and revisit the film 2 or 3 times later, you start to pinpoint new meanings from it, which makes it one of the more, like you said, it's maybe one of the more artful shots of the year, even if it's not the most noticeably extravagant shot of the decade. And I love it for those reasons. It's actually a nice segue into one of my favorite shots of the decade so far, because I think it actually works for the exact same reasons as what Charlotte Wells is doing in After Sun. And I'm sure this is also on your list, so we can talk about this one collectively. The final shot of All We Imagine Is Light from last year. I think, the Payal Kapadia film, starring Kani Kasrudi, Divya Prabha, and Chaya Kadam. I hope I'm pronouncing those names right. But I'm sure you had this on your list as well.
For sure.
Absolutely. We talked about it quite a bit when we did our 2024 award show. And for a lot of the same reasons that you just talked about with After Sun, I think this final shot carries a lot of the same attributes. The DNA is kind of there for similar reasons. It's a multi-layered shot where each layer has its own meaning, its own symbolic purpose. In this case, you kind of have this like literal middle horizon of sorts, splitting this difference between the more rural side of this backdrop with the more artificially lit side of this backdrop, kind of fusing these two different worlds together, the urban and the rural, which this movie is ultimately all about setting. And this shot is kind of the perfect summation of those ideas. So for a lot of the same reasons you already talked about with After Sun, I think this shot at the end of All We Imagine Is Light more or less does the same thing. I think there's a nice parallel there we can make.
I love this shot as well. It's absolutely on my list, and it's another stationary shot, which I just find brilliant. It's amazing what you can paint with a still camera, and that ending sequence with All We Imagine Is Light is brilliant. It is utterly brilliant. Really, the only difference between the two is the use of music. With this last shot, there's no music.
That's true.
At least not in the moment that we were. It
is. This one's maybe a little bit more cinematic by comparison,
for sure,
because it has other factors working alongside it.
Yeah, absolutely. And the music, I do think, is vital to the moment. It helps enhance the euphoria that you're feeling there at the end of that film. But the composition itself still carries a lot of weight for all the reasons you're talking about. I absolutely love it. The duality of the night sky with that of the oceans and the neon lights, the girls sitting together, bringing in the boyfriend as well, having that moment of togetherness and how it crystallizes the film's themes around loneliness and them being away, how that is an oasis away from the manufactured artificial bustle of the city is phenomenal. I agree. Incredible moment. I'm still riding a high, and it's only been a few months. We're still a few months removed, and it's like I just got done watching it all over again.
It's one of the best films of the decade. We're going to be talking about a lot of those films. So you're right. This is a great precursor to our best films of the decade so far, because we might get a lot of films here that are going to show up on our lists in some way, shape, or form. I love that our first two picks here for best shots of the decade so far are both stationary shots. I like that we're going simple at first, because
and from female directors.
Yeah, that's another great point too. A lot of great talent out there. A lot of great talent.
Yeah. I do want to buck the trend a little bit for this next shot.
Okay.
It's from a prominent filmmaker that many of us love and adore, but it is, to your point, the theme of this episode, of course, and as we get to best of the decade here in a few months, Oppenheimer. I'm going to go to Oppenheimer now. Christopher Nolan.
I am so curious what shot you're going to pick, because I have Oppenheimer on my list, and I basically have after it, pause the movie anywhere and you have one of the best shots.
No,
it's
I have several films on my list that are similar to that, where it's like, just pick anything.
Just pick anything. Yeah.
There are two that come to mind. One of them is the ending shot of that film, right? The extreme close up there on Oppenheimer and that look of, oh no, I've destroyed the world. Absolutely incredible. And on the same token, I think very, very similar thematically and emotionally speaking, the horror on Oppenheimer during the gymnasium scene. Like those close-ups there are equally haunting, and I think are great summations of the film.
I agree. I think if I had to pick at least something from Oppenheimer, my first thought was to go to the gymnasium scene, but I was kind of going back and forth on that mentality, because I wasn't sure if I was just picking the scene or if I was picking a shot from the scene for the purposes of this exercise. But there are shots within that scene that are truly horrifying. And I think, which is interesting, because I have another shot that I want to talk about in a little bit that I think might be the most horrifying shot of the decade so far. But I do think at least one or two of these shots from the gymnasium scene in Oppenheimer also qualify for that exact very thing, especially when we get a few images of these, of what Oppenheimer envisions as these decomposing bodies. Those are horrific moments that are just seared into my brain, and a lot of that is just captured in a certain way from Hoyt van Hoytma. But it's also how editing works alongside cinematography as well. I think Oppenheimer's a great example of when you have a great shot or just a great sequence of shots in a movie, there's so many things working in parallel with one another. And sometimes a great shot is also coupled by great editing, which is the case in here. In this film.
Yeah. And that scene could still hold up as the best scene of the decade at this point. I haven't done that exercise quite yet. It was my scene of the year for 2024, I believe is what that film came out.
Oh, it was mine as well.
2023.
2023. Yeah.
2023. Sorry, that's what I meant to say. That was my scene of that year. I haven't done the exercise for best of the decade so far, but off the cuff, that might be my number one.
Maybe for me as well. I have to do that exercise, but it's definitely up there. I'm with you as far as it being the best scene of 2023. I agree with you on that. I think we both had it at number one.
Worst case, it's in my top three for scenes of the decade.
How dare
and I think
you.
that's why
how dare
I go
you.
To,
it is here. JD says it's a bad scene by putting it at number 3 of the decade.
I know. But that's why I immediately go to those shots, those extreme close-ups, especially of Robert completely submitting to his paranoia and fear. And the way the creation of the scene from Nolan, from a directorial standpoint, the editing, as you're talking about, the use of music, the ethereal imagery, the nightmarish elements that Nolan throws in there, all of that works for the sequence as a whole. But if we're going to pick out individual shots, there are a few there, like those haunting images. And again, it's Murphy's performance as well. He's such a big, crucial component to that sequence. But my God, I mean, those are stills you can pull from that film, and you feel the visceral horror that he's experiencing there.
Yeah, I often try to, I guess, qualify a great shot in a movie like this for the purpose of this exercise as something that might still be a bit painterly, if that makes sense. Like if I were to pause the movie on that individual shot, is it still something I feel like I could hang on my wall and there's some artistic merit to it, disregarding the other aspects that are making it so great, like we're talking about? I do think there are sequences from this scene that still allow it to qualify in that same way, despite how harrowing that it is and how all of these different filmmaking components are working together to make it as horrifying as it is. There are still individual paused moments, if you will, that still have a amazing beauty to them. It's an interesting it's an interesting transition to my next shot from the decade that I want to highlight. I did allude to this, that I did want to pick something that I feel like is the most horrifying shot of the year. Now, this is one I would never print out and hang on my wall because it's just too damn horrifying. When you posted your After Sun tweet out there, and this whole thing was going viral with other people participating in some of their favorite shots of the decade, a movie that came up a lot was Jordan Peele's Nope. I'm going to Nope for my next pick, but the shot I'm going with, it's the inside of Jean Jacket, the consuming scene.
Oh my goodness.
This is one of the scariest things I've seen in the past 10 years or so. Maybe not even just within movies. It is an absolutely terrifying sequence. Again, a lot of other things that can play a factor into this, great sound editing, great sound mixing, all make it as horrifying as it is. But the shot is so frightening because of, first off, what Jordan Peele chooses to show us, but more importantly, what he doesn't choose to show us. And sometimes a great shot can work because of what it chooses to hold back. There's so much about this sequence that is revealing, but also not revealing at all. And I think that's what makes it so horrifying, because it somehow has it both ways. It gives you what you're waiting for without giving you what you were waiting for. And the sequence itself is just downright disturbing. Even a paused image of it, because you're trying to make out exactly what's happening, and you still can't really tell. It is truly disturbing stuff and will probably haunt me for the rest of my life, if I'm being honest. I think it's that good.
It's incredibly disturbing. I think what that scene also does is that it demonstrates the deep effect a shot can have despite how brief it might be. Because that shot is not very long.
No.
It's not very long, but man, the effect that it has is incredible. It is really, really good.
I love it. I also hate it because it scares me so much, but I love that it does, because that means it's doing its job. It's
really
job.
Good. I also have Nope on my list as well, but the shot that I have is the exterior shot of the alien over the house, raining blood down on the house. Yeah, that's the shot of that movie for me.
Definitely the most painterly shot from the
for
movie.
Sure. Yeah. Oh my gosh, that's one of those movies where you could pick out 24, 30, 40 different shots of that film qualify for this list.
Well,
I mean,
once again,
the cinematography is incredible.
Once again, Hoyt von Hoytma doing the Lord's work.
Oh my gosh, it's so good. On the theme of horrifying, a shot that I have on this list as well, and this goes back to last year, another recent movie, the courtroom scene in Red Rooms. The shot of the security guards taking her out of the courtroom, and that smirk she has on her face with the getup that she had put on, another one of those hair-raising moments. Absolutely disturbing, but similar to the effect that you were talking about as far as your shot for Nope. It's a similar guttural reaction that you have to that scene that is quite effective.
Apparently we like nightmare fuel on this show.
Clearly. But it's a great shot.
It's a great shot.
Great shot.
It's 3 picks in a row where we might not be able to sleep at night. Maybe we should change things up a little bit. I'm going to pick my next shot here as something that's a bit more, I say optimistic, but it's in a film that's not necessarily optimistic. It's actually the one that I tweeted out as far as my pick for quote unquote shot of the decade, even though I don't necessarily think it's my favorite. It's just the first one that came to mind, but it's the final shot of The Fabelmans, Steven Spielberg's The Fabelmans.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, very common one, I feel like. It's not really a surprise pick. I'm sure a lot of people share this opinion. Of course, the shot being as great as it is, coming off the heels of young Fabelman's meeting with John Ford, sadly played by David Lynch, rest in peace, and the whole lesson about the horizon not supposed to be in the middle. The lesson that it should be in the top or the bottom, otherwise it's boring as shit, as he puts it. So of course we get that final shot of young Fabelman leaving the Hollywood studios there, and the shot is stationary with the horizon in the middle, only for it to then correct itself at the last second. So again, symbolic purpose, kind of an obvious symbolic purpose, but a very touching one, honestly. And I like that the film concludes in a very optimistic and touching tone for a movie that was kind of bitter in its journey getting to that point, which I thought was really interesting. So I at least wanted to highlight that one because I think it, once again, shows how a static shot with even just a little bit of movement has so much to say. And this one absolutely does as well.
Yeah, I love The Fabelmans. That is a film that I already really, really liked. It was in my top 10 of the year it came out, and it's only grown on me more since then. That moment you're talking about, I think, is fantastic. Completely agree for all those reasons. I would also add to it seeing the shot from that film that I would have on this particular list is the mirror shot.
Oh yeah, when he's filming his parents' divorce.
When he's filming his parents, and you get that jump scare. I didn't really mean to have like a horror theme here, and The Fabelmans is obviously not a horror movie, but that is almost like a jump scare in that movie.
Kind of is. It's really it's very cynical. It's a very cynical moment. Yeah,
very, very cynical moment in that movie, but what it speaks to Sammy foundationally, I think, is absolutely phenomenal, and it has this great emotional and thematic effect to it. So I love the mirror scene in that film as far as shots of the decade go. That's the shot that stands out to me, but similarly there's several from that movie. It is a really, really well shot movie on the
Janusz Kaminski, baby.
Yeah, so good. Another scene shot that I want to go to, and when I was putting this list together, I didn't really have this theme in mind, but as we're talking here organically, I feel like this theme of horror is coming to the forefront for whatever reason.
I'll change things up. I'll keep changing it up so we don't stay in the world of horror.
But look, I can't help myself, and this isn't a traditional horror movie, but it is deeply disturbing and haunting. It is The Zone of Interest, and it is that shot at the end of the film of Rudolph in the corridor there by the stairs, right? And what's great about the moment is this is Rudolph wrestling with his legacy, but it starts off with him coming down the stairwell, and as he gets to the bottom of the stairs, we see that he's physically unwell, and he vomits there. And we cut to this shot where the camera is at the end of this vacant corridor. Rudolph is about halfway through the frame there by the stairs, and behind him is this giant black void that I called From Under the Skin. the giant void from under the skin is behind him.
It's Jonathan Glazer, after all.
It is Jonathan Glazer, after all. Exactly. And Rudolph is looking around confused, and he looks back at that black void with this uncertainty before he quickly composes himself. And it's this striking microcosm of the film that I think is incredible, especially when you couple this shot with what happens right afterward, where Glazer cuts to the inside of Auschwitz as it is today, which I think is a brilliant way to tether those two things together, like his legacy and the cost of his legacy. I think is incredible, absolutely incredible. I mean, the artistry on display there, is phenomenal. So that shot of Rudolph in the corridor with the under the skin void behind him is one that just it lingers, like it just continues to haunt in this incredible way. And similarly, that's a film that has grown on me even more so than it did when it came out. And that was a film that was already in my top 5 when it came out, and I'm loving that film more and more and more. And I think it's because of shots like that in the film that just continue to stay with you. And it's incredible.
Christian Friedel's performance is really quite haunting in that movie. I'm not sure if you're watching The White Lotus on Max at all, but he's in season 3, and he plays, for lack of a better use of terminology, he plays a completely sad dork in season 3. It's
Nice.
so weird seeing that in conjunction with his horrifying performance in The Zone of Interest, which I love versatility like that. I just do.
For sure. Absolutely.
Wanted to call him out as well because I think he gives a great performance in The Zone of Interest, and he's clearly showing some range here. As far as another shot I wanted to highlight here, I'm not really sure where to go. I felt like we were doing a pretty good job keeping like some thematic momentum going between our picks, but I feel like my next one is going to be a bit random now, changing gears kind of heavily. I'll go to this next one because it's one of the most bitterly romantic shots of the decade, and this is coming from a filmmaker who is very much known for creating beautiful looking movies, and that's Paul Thomas Anderson. So in the movie Licorice Pizza, there are many great shots in that movie, but the one that always stuck out to me was the waterbed scene. And I think it's there's and I called it bitterly romantic because I think that's a movie that is still to this day about us as an audience questioning the validity of this type of romance or quote unquote romance that we see unfolding on screen. So he tries to make that crystal clear for us in a visual way that's also kind of disorienting as much as it is sweet and tender. And there's like an almost heavenly floaty quality to it, a glow to it, but there's also something kind of off about it. Never seen anything like it, and I think that balance really is why the film works in having this kind of two-way conversation about what this relationship essentially is, and whether it's something that we should be cheering for or not. Maybe a lot of that is also because of the music in the background. The song "Let Me Roll It" I think adds a certain tonal, just a tonal importance to it. But the shot on its own is just so disorienting and so unique that I wanted to highlight that one as well.
I love that scene. It honestly didn't come to mind earlier when I was doing my prep for this conversation. I love the film. I think it's really great.
Oh, yeah.
I know it has its detractors, but I really love the film. I love that sequence. I'm glad that you call it out. It also tethers very well, very, very well to another film and moment that I have on my list.
Oh, perfect. And we're back to connecting things together. I love it.
Yes. I think Bitterly Romantic absolutely describes the ending to Past Lives.
Oh,
that moment between those two characters.
Oh, that's a good one. That's a good one.
Facing off against each other and knowing that this probably will be the last time they ever see each other, despite having perhaps a fleeting romance in the past, or there's certainly a lot of what ifs, what could have been, but they have their separate lives now and they face each other. It's wonderfully lit. And that moment, that shot, and the emotional weight that I would again absolutely describe as bitterly romantic. I like the weight of that in that moment, I think is fantastic. And that was on my list. So those two scenes, now that you bring it up, are honestly doing very similar things despite the context being different.
They're kind of cousins in a way. But there is something about that Past Live shot that has always stuck out to me. I'm actually kind of kicking myself for not even having it on my list. I'm also a sucker for like steady, still tracking shots like that final
Yeah.
shot
Oh
is.
yeah, like that last tracking shot. Oh, that's
Yeah,
so good.
yeah, but it's so subtle that you almost forget that that's actually a pretty long shot that concludes the film. You might
Yeah.
see the movie once or twice, and when you think back on how great that scene is,
Mhm.
you might think the final shot is just her crying in her boyfriend's arms, but there's actually more to it. There's an extended tracking shot of a previous goodbye leading to that embrace, and the subtlety, the trickery of all that. Sometimes the best long takes are ones that you don't even notice as a long take. And I think this is a great example of not calling attention to itself. And I'm a sucker for shots that do that. So I love the technical side of it as well as the bitterly romantic side of it that you're highlighting.
For sure. Yeah, I completely agree. I do have several more I want to list. We are running a little long, and we have Lawrence of Arabia to get to. So
we'll get through that in 4 minutes.
Let's just quickly name off a bunch. We don't have to get into these too in deeply, but I at least wanted to name off a bunch.
Yeah.
So we'll do these rapid fire.
Okay.
All right. On my list, I also have the upside down statue and cross. 2 shots there for the brutalist.
Okay. Have that as well.
Killers of the Flower Moon. For me, the field burning outside of the house, that whole sequence is phenomenal.
Yep.
Killers of the Flower Moon, though, again, a dozen different entries there, right? I mean,
apparently Martin
cinematography
Scorsese
is
knows how to direct
remarkable.
movies.
Yeah, it turns out. Nickel Boys, pick any frame. Don't care which one, just pick any frame.
That's another one I had on here. Like I knew I wanted to highlight something from Nickel Boys because it might be the best shot film of the decade.
It might
but
be,
I can't. But I can't pick an individual shot.
I don't know how to narrow it down. I agree.
I will say the one that did come to mind was, and I don't even know if I can qualify because I feel like it's a great shot by accident. It's the one where Jomo Frey's cinematography steadily dips and looks down, and Angelino Ellis Taylor says, "Look at me," and it looks back up. Which apparently
so
was an
good.
accident, from what I understand.
That's so good, though. Oh
It shows how willing to participate everyone was with that movie.
Yeah, no, I agree. Like that moment or the hugs, how the camera interacts there.
Yeah.
Those shots in the film are phenomenal. If you want to consider something more quote unquote conventional, as in a still frame, the shot early on with the TVs in the window and you get the reflection there off the glass.
Yeah.
And Martin Luther King Jr. on the TVs there, phenomenal there. But a million different shots. Those are just a few examples. You could really take that whole film there. Nosferatu, the carriage coming to a crossroads, I think is a beautiful striking shot in that film. Going back to Spielberg, West Side Story, the sweeping shot through the gymnasium during the dance sequence.
So good.
Is one that comes to mind. Love that. And All of Us Strangers, the Christmas tree scene, that shot of the 3 of them in the frame putting up the Christmas tree, I think is incredible. After Yang is another one that came to mind. I think After Yang, and I was looking through this film. I didn't have a chance to rewatch it for this conversation, obviously, but I was looking through a bunch of stills from that film. I think that has a case for being one of the most underrated films of the decade so far. And not just in terms of its overall quality, and it very much qualifies for that, but even in terms of cinematography.
There's craft.
That film
there's a lot of craft to that movie.
Really well shot.
Yeah.
There's one moment that stands out to me where Colin, like his character, I forget his character. I want to say it's Jake. I could be totally wrong. I want to say his character's name
I'll look this up for you, but I think it's a J. It is a J.
If I get this right, bonus points for me. I could be way wrong though. I don't know. At any rate,
It's Jake.
I love him so much in that
sir.
film.
Well done, good sir.
Thank you. But yeah, there's a moment in that film where Jake is making tea, and tea is this through line throughout that film. And as he's making tea, in the background, you have these gorgeous yellow hues that light up all of these tea sets and pottery behind and glasses behind him. And it's just this really gorgeous shot that emphasizes the culture of tea, which is important to that character in that film. So it's not just gorgeously rendered on its own terms. It's beautiful to look at, but there is a thematic prowess to it as well.
Yeah.
Which is why I brought it up here.
Well, and we like shots that do that.
I didn't mean to. I said I wouldn't go in depth, and then I caught myself.
Well, sometimes a movie like that seems to still feel somewhat under the radar, unfortunately. You kind of feel like you owe it to the film to be a bit more in depth, right?
Exactly. I have to defend it a little bit.
It's like, guys, see this movie. It's actually pretty good.
Yeah. On the theme, and we love a good theme, on the theme of underrated cinematography, though, the little indie film Hit the Road.
Oh, it's a beautiful.
The cinematography to that film is extraordinary. Not enough people have seen that film. Go watch it. It's really good, and you'll be blown away by how it looks. It is phenomenal from a visual perspective. And there are several good ones from that film. Same thing with Kelly Reichardt's First Cow, which was my favorite film of 2020.
Yeah.
Beautiful looking movie. Absolutely gorgeous. Several great contenders there. And I know this last one I want to bring up is a little, I hate to say controversial. Not everyone will agree with me. But I think Bo Burnham's Inside qualifies as a film.
That's a film.
I think it walks and acts like a documentary. And when something walks and acts like a documentary, I'm going to treat it like a documentary. And Inside is also extraordinarily shot. And like the one of him up against the wall with the cross is perhaps my favorite, but there are so many good shots from that doc.
It's a docu-musical, or whatever the term is. It's a fusion of those two things.
Exactly. And a couple more films real fast. Honora, The Final Shot, we've talked about a lot. That's on my list here. Several from Queer. The Green Knight, another one of those. I don't know where to begin. The cinematography across the board.
I just call it the skeleton shot. The circular skeleton shot is probably the one that comes to mind the most.
Yes. Yeah. The Power of the Dog. Again, so many. Maybe the couple embracing out there in the open field, I think is really great. The Northman has so many great shots. Decision to Leave came to mind for me as well.
Oh, Decision to Leave is one of the best shot films of the decade. That is
so good.
It's Park Chan-wook, man. He knows how to shoot a movie.
Gosh. Yes, he does. And Close My Eyes, the final shot to Close My Eyes came to mind for me as well.
Oh, that's a good one. Yeah, love that movie. I'm so glad I got a chance to catch up with that before the year ended.
Are there any others briefly you want to mention real quick?
Yeah, my favorite film from 2024, Furiosa, Mad Max Saga, has got quite a few great shots. The two that came to mind were there's a moment where young Furiosa's wig gets caught in the branches, and there's a huge time lapse of it basically being wrapped by these branches. That's a beautiful sequence, as well as the attacking of the war rig, the main action sequence of that film, and the way the camera just levitates and hovers over it is really acrobatic and beautifully staged. So that's one I had here. I know it's become kind of the butt of a joke, but it doesn't change the fact that Damien Chazelle's Babylon is still a very well shot film. And the sequence that's very heavily joked about is the one with Margot Robbie dancing at the party in the beginning of the movie. It's done as a one-take sequence, but it's very well staged. It's a very well staged sequence.
It's really great.
And we have to call attention to the trickery of it because it is good trickery. And I know it might get me in trouble. I think that might be Damien Chazelle's best film. So whatever. I mean, it's that and First Man.
It's really great. I love
that and First Man. They're my two favorite films of his. And he's doing good stuff there. The last one I'll mention here, most of what you had listed are ones that I also had on my list, so I don't have to go into them again. But I mean, when we're talking about some of my favorite things of the decade so far, whether it be in film or aspects of film like shots or sequences or whatever, I mean, I owe it to myself to at least acknowledge Petite Maman. Right. And of course, that final hug between the two young girls is the thing that gets me every time. So just going to highlight that very quickly.
All right. I know there's many, many more we could have listed. We tried to go through a couple that resonate with us. There are so many great shots that define the 2020s so far. Of course, if we left anything out, you can leave a comment below if you're watching us on YouTube, or if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, just reach out to us on social media. We would love to hear from you. All right, Brendan, let's talk about audiobooks. I love a good audiobook.
I love stories.
I know you do as well.
I love stories.
Are great.
Yep. I love a platform that has so many stories for you to pick from, all different types. Yep. That's what makes Audible so great.
Audible is fantastic. They have over 150,000 titles. At this point, they might have 1 million because they got everything up there.
Oh, it's a library. It's not even, actually, to call it a library, it's like the most underappreciated way of saying what they actually have on their platform.
Yes. And the great thing about Audible is that they have all types of books. You have your sci-fis, you got your romance novels, you got your YA novels, all that sort of fun stuff. But they also have books on business, sports, all kinds of fun things. You can dabble into any kind of genre or type of book that you want. They have it all there, which is so fantastic. So
yeah, I believe that you were reading some stuff about marketing, if I'm not mistaken, weren't you?
Yes. There was a marketing book that I was reading last year. There was a hockey book that I was diving into recently, which was fantastic. So, and I've been slowly but surely getting through Lord of the Rings, and I've just come to admit defeat that I don't love Tolkien's writing. It's just not for me. It's just not for me.
So you kept going, and the songs just didn't stop, from what I understand.
Well,
right?
With the first book, yes. Eventually, you got to a point once they kind of got away from the Shire, which is kind of heartbreaking because in the films, I love those scenes. They're great. In book form, I needed them to get away from the Shire as fast as humanly possible.
Yeah,
I could not take the singing. Eventually, everything settled in and it was fine.
Yeah.
And then with the second book, it's not the singing, it's that you spend 700 pages with Treebeard. Like just talking about.
Is it 700
nothing.
pages in a row, or
I don't know what it is.
Okay.
Because I'm listening through it via audiobook. So I don't know how many pages it is, but it's like
you're just throwing an arbitrary number
audiobook.
there, but still, I get you.
It's like 17 hours. That's what it feels like anyway. Again, I don't know what the real number is, but Treebeard goes on for freaking ever.
Well,
this like, make it stop.
This just goes to show the versatility of what Audible has to offer. Books about hockey, books about marketing, and audiobooks about talking trees.
God, yeah. So, like, I'm not giving up, but I am admitting defeat. Tolkien, I will eventually get through them all, but to this point, I just don't know if he's for me. As much as I love the movies. Not sure on the books. At any rate, yes. Audible has everything. If you want to get a free audiobook, 30-day free trial, audibletrial.com/InSessionFilm. Again, that's audibletrial.com/InSessionFilm. Use that link and you'll get a free audiobook and a 30-day free trial. It's great. I truly love Audible. I use it all the time and cannot say enough good things about it. Go check them out, and we thank Audible for their support. All right, Brendan, let's talk about the InSession Film store. Let's talk about T-shirts, merchandise.
Swag. Let's talk about nihilism as we're seeing here.
I got some little nihilism is sexy bacon. I do love this shirt a lot. We have a lot of great designs up there at TeePublic that you can go and check out. We have a new one if you're fans of The Substance. I'm going to get this shirt very soon. It just says Academy Award winner, The Substance, which is crazy.
I love it.
The Substance is an Academy Award winner, which is not something I don't think any one of us expected this time last year.
It is so incredible.
A movie like The Substance.
Tried showing that movie to my wife. It did not go over very well.
I'm not even going to bother with No way she would go. Yeah, she would hate that film. Yeah. So look, it's not for everybody, but that's why it's incredible that it's an Oscar winner. So, so we got a new design for that up. There's Chasing the Goal. There's Women in Session merch as well. Of course, we got stuff with our logo on it. We have a really great Lester Bangs quote that
Yeah.
you can get up there as well. I love that shirt. We got an Arrival shirt, Stop Turning Art in the Sports, all kinds of fun stuff.
Absolutely.
That you can check out there at TeePublic. Go to tpublic.com/stores/InSessionFilm. We'll, of course, have a link in the description below if you want to check that out. Or you can just go to InSessionFilm.com/store, and you'll see a bunch of the items there as well. No matter how you help us out, which design you go after, go get a t-shirt, a pin, sticker, whatever it is that you want up there. But we really do appreciate your support. Okay, with all of that said, let's go ahead and transition to our Best Picture movie series. We have covered The Apartment and West Side Story, the first two films from the 1960s. We are now on to 1962 with David Lean's Lawrence of Arabia.
Yeah.
So before we get into it, it's really interesting because, for one, Brendan has technically, officially reviewed this film on the InSession Film Podcast before.
I think we have to acknowledge that and bring it up because it might make this conversation a little interesting. It might make it a little bit restrictive in a way because I don't want to just regurgitate everything I said 5 years ago. But yeah, you're right. I did review this on the previous Extra Film platform with Jay Lebbett and Ryan McQuaid when they were doing their David Lean movie series. And of course, when you're talking about David Lean, you have to talk about Lawrence of Arabia. And I joined them for that one.
Yep. It was, to your point, quite a few years ago, though. A lot of people listening may not remember that conversation or your thoughts exactly. I do look forward to getting into this conversation. But I did want to highlight that we have technically covered this film before, but it's been a few years.
Yeah.
I was not a part of that conversation, though. I've never given my full thoughts on Lawrence of Arabia. And I'm glad that we're doing this now because I do have a fascinating history with this film. For whatever reason, don't ask me to articulate why, because I could not tell you. The old me was a dummy. Okay, let's just get that out there. That's just
there have been a few episodes where you've acknowledged that young JD was maybe a little simple-minded. We'll simply say
I had a few moments. Let's just put it that way.
We all have, to be fair.
Yeah, I did not love Lawrence of Arabia the first time that I saw it, and again, could not tell you why. And I don't really care to wrestle with that. Because it doesn't matter anymore. I have come around on Lawrence of Arabia. A couple of rewatches down the road, and boy, have I done a 180 on Lawrence of Arabia. So, however I felt about it all those years ago, it doesn't matter. My thoughts here are going to reflect something very, very different. I look forward to getting into it. I'm glad that we've arrived to this point.
Yeah, this 1960s Best Picture winning series thus far, between The Apartment, West Side Story, and now Lawrence of Arabia, man, this is going downhill fast, isn't it? Right?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know how. Like, the Academy, as far as certain runs go, that's as good of a 3-year run as they've ever had. I don't know if they've ever had another 3-year run close to that.
Let's look at this.
I haven't done that research, but
let's look at this a little bit further because we're obviously going to talk about Tom Jones next week, so we can't weigh in on that yet, whether that turns into a 4-year run. But if we look at the year before The Apartment, when Ben-Hur won Best Picture.
That's a good point. That's also a good point. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there are still some good movies that Ben-Hur was nominated against back in 1959. But it's a classic film. It's an important film. So the stature of that victory, I think, might make that a 4-year kind of cool run, I guess. It's a pretty good one.
I will say I'm kind of looking ahead, although it's not quite the same because there are some in between that somewhat undercuts the consistency of a direct 4-year run. But the Academy in the 70s, they did pretty well. They did a good job. I'll just say that they did a pretty good job in the 70s.
The difference between the 60s and the 70s, though, like when you look at a year like, I don't know, 1975, for instance, anything could have won Best Picture. It would have been a good win.
that lineup is ridiculous.
Lineup is stupid.
So good.
That lineup
It
is stupid.
So dumb. Yeah, I mean, talk about nailing the nominations. I mean, yeah, incredible.
Yeah, but
That-
there are
that one
there
is-
are yeah. There are a few
Yeah.
years in 1975 for that particular decade where I think it almost falls into that kind of situation. Maybe not quite as noticeably as 1975, but heck, I mean, The Godfather Part 2 wins Best Picture the year before that, but some people might prefer The Conversation. Some people might prefer Chinatown. Classic
Yeah,
films,
that's-
right?
Yeah, though that's another, like, any of those three could have won, and we wouldn't look at the 70s all that differently
No,
if that was the
No.
case.
I'm with you. Makes it really
I
interesting.
do wonder what history or how history could have looked, though, if, let's say, The Exorcist won in 1973 instead of The Sting. Man, that
I
would have
think
been
that- yeah.
fascinating.
That
Would have been
would have
fascinating.
made more sense, I think, just given the stature of that film compared to The Sting, which I think is a fun movie, a very fun
Could you
movie. I like
imagine
The Sting.
if we went from Patton to The French Connection to The Godfather to The Exorcist to The Godfather Part 2 to One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest to Rocky to Annie Hall? I mean, good Lord. Okay.
That's
Okay.
especially when you look at what movies would normally win Best Picture in the 2000s and maybe 1990s, just in general. That's like the
Mm-hmm.
70s that's kind of rude. It's kind of rude.
It is. And I will say, like, we give the Academy a hard time. I do think, the transition from the 70s to the 90s and through the early 2000s, it wasn't always great. It
No.
wasn't always great. And even like the late 2000s, early 2010s, there were some big misses, I think.
Sure.
But, and we've talked about this a lot over the last few years, so I don't have to hammer the point home. But I do think where the Academy is going now, it feels kind of reminiscent of the quality we got in the 70s, which is exciting.
The kind of films that they seem to be honoring, if it's the big film from that particular year, it seems to be the right one. If it's a smaller film, it also seems to be the right one. So yeah, I think you're not wrong in that analysis there. It does seem to be somewhat comparable to what we saw in previous decades, for sure.
Yeah. And look, I know I'm getting into a rabbit hole on the 70s because, good Lord, that decade is incredible. But the 60s has some great films, which is why we're here. And I'm very excited to get to the rest of this decade and Lawrence of Arabia. That's where we are now. 1962. Let's go ahead and dig into this all-time classic. As you noted, Brendan, it is directed by one David Lean. Man, good at his job. We'll say that.
Yeah.
It stars one Peter O'Toole, as well as Alec Guinness, Anthony Quinn, Jack Hawkins, Claude Rains, Omar Sharif, and a bunch of others. A bunch of others that come and go throughout film. You are absolutely familiar with Lawrence of Arabia. But to reiterate, it tells the story of one T.E. Lawrence, the English officer who successfully united and led the diverse, often warring Arab tribes during World War I in order to fight the Turks. All right, Brendan, let's jump into it. What did you think about Lawrence of Arabia?
So when I reviewed this back with Jay and Rhyme 5 years ago, I acknowledged that it was a first-time watch for me back then. So 5 years ago, I finally caught up with this one. And it's interesting to see it in that way for how influential the film was. I mean, there's nothing we can really say about this film that hasn't already been said. I think the most interesting way to phrase it, at least the most interesting way that I can come up with it, is that if you haven't seen Lawrence of Arabia yet, you've seen Lawrence of Arabia. You have. Whether you've seen the movie itself, you've seen Lawrence of Arabia. Okay, you've seen Indiana Jones, you've kind of seen Lawrence of Arabia. Even Steven Spielberg himself has acknowledged that this is his favorite movie. And the first half of Lawrence of Arabia is very reminiscent of an Indiana Jones-like adventure. I mean, so much of the first half of this movie went on to essentially create every desert adventure movie ever made afterwards. So there's so much of that in there. I mean, basically what Spielberg would do was take the sophistication of Lawrence of Arabia and fuse it with those old serials that were the basis of an Indiana Jones-like adventure, and that was the creation of Raiders of the Lost Ark. So whether you've seen Lawrence of Arabia or not, you've kind of seen it. And an even bigger example, if you've seen Dune, you have absolutely seen Lawrence of Arabia.
Yep. 100%.
I mean,
100%.
Of course, Dune has existed for a long time, tracing all the way back to Frank Herbert's original novel. And then, of course, David Lynch's notorious adaptation in the early 80s. But specifically, if you've seen Denis Villeneuve's films, Dune Part 1 and Dune Part 2, together, that is absolutely Lawrence of Arabia. It's the same
and
art.
Especially when we get to Dune Messiah, how that parallels the second half of Lawrence of Arabia. The parallels are striking between those two stories, for sure.
They absolutely are, which is why something we said just a few weeks ago, JD, when we talked about The Apartment, the Billy Wilder film, I called that one of the best tale of two halves movies that we've perhaps ever talked about on the show. We probably should have saved that distinction for Lawrence of Arabia, because this is the most literal tale of two halves movie I can think of where it absolutely earns that distinction, where each half, split by a very appropriate intermission, kind of functions as two separate movies in a way. It makes for a complete arc and a complete journey. And it's so interesting that someone like David Lean was able to create something like this when much of his films before this were very, I guess, domestic by comparison. His previous masterpiece was Brief Encounter, which is completely antithetical to a movie like this.
Yeah, but a masterpiece on its own. Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's you can't even really compare the two. You really can't.
No, you can't.
Yeah, but Lawrence of Arabia, it's a great movie. It's an absolutely great movie. And I think what makes it great and what surprised me most about it when I first saw it 5 years ago is the way it kind of tricked me. And I wonder if it tricked audiences the same way when it first came out in 1962, which was promising you this epic desert adventure, which it does give you until it doesn't. And I was not ready for that when I first saw the film. And I kind of loved that ignorant experience I had with it, because the psychology of T.E. Lawrence himself, I think, is the most fascinating thing about this movie, and why I think it has so much staying power on top of just the filmmaking prowess that it is. So yeah, great movie. Rightful Best Picture winner, I think.
Yeah, this is one of the best films of all time. It is truly an astounding cinematic achievement. It is big, it's vast, it's epic in every sense of the word. The cinematography, I don't know what to say about it that hasn't been said already. To your point, Brendan, it is breathtaking. It is truly, and I know we mentioned this earlier on the show, but it truly is one of the best shot films ever made. The desert imagery is sensational, truly awe-inducing. But I also love the production design we see in Cairo and Jerusalem. Those scenes are wonderfully crafted. Everything is large in scope. But for all of its technical merit, it's also one of the best character studies ever put to film. Lawrence's rise to prominence, only for him to lose his identity and become claimed by the desert as he succumbs to his savior complex, is just as extraordinary as the filmmaking. Lawrence rejects where he comes from. He sees himself as a savior to the Arab people, a belief that fuels his ambitions and hubris. He relishes in the role of the hero and even adopts the Arab garb. However, that ethos is what becomes his downfall as he increasingly becomes detached from reality, and his ideals clash when the British Empire war with the fractured Arab tribes. And what we see is a man whose desire to save the Arabs blind him from the complexities of politics on both sides and the limits of his own influence. And in the end, he is left disillusioned and psychologically scarred. This film is a captivating critique of the savior complex, not only showing us the broader dangers of intervening under the guise of salvation, but more poignantly demonstrating the individual costs that come as a side effect. It is truly one of the most sophisticated films ever made from a storytelling perspective, which is wild because I feel like that is always secondary to its filmmaking craft. You bring up Lawrence of Arabia, a lot of the time people want to talk about its achievements in terms of its legacy, in terms of what it was able to pull off in the desert. And I totally understand that. The cinematography, the editing, the craft here, it truly is mesmerizing. And I think you could flip those conversations and its legacy is the exact same because the nuances, the psychological nuances and textures here are just as riveting and just as layered. And not enough can be said about Peter O'Toole's performance. It is phenomenal what he does here.
Oh my
We'll
gosh.
talk more about it as we go. It is incredible. But yes, I agree with everything you said. One of the best films ever made, hands down.
Yeah, it's Dune. He's Paul Atreides. He absolutely is. And it's actually kind of insane how similar that these movies are, these stories are. It just not even in the characterization of T.E. Lawrence himself and how similar it is to Paul Atreides. It's just the narrative trajectory that these stories go on. They are very similar. I just find it so wild how this film functions as this tale of two halves when both halves really do feel like completely different experiences. So on one hand, with that first half, you do remember the scope of this movie, and rightfully so. That's where the vibrancy is most important. That's where the filmmaking is most important. It's giving you this this adventure tale essentially, only for it to then deconstruct that in a very horrific way. The back half can be a little bit messier, but it's rightfully messy as it gets into the messy politics of how T.E. Lawrence is essentially torn between these two sides, and then tragically so when he realizes how much of a pawn he was for the British army, and without really ever realizing it. And I think that's where the sadness of this story is most affecting, and why I love Peter O'Toole's performance so much, is how this really just functions as a tale about a man who really didn't belong anywhere. And his journey to try to belong somewhere just led him even more disassociated from that journey as he tried harder and harder with that, especially when that savior complex that you're talking about becomes more apparent. I think that is so... It's harrowing. It's really harrowing stuff. Peter O'Toole plays it in that back half kind of like a horror villain in some ways. There are some truly frightening sequences there that I don't know of anyone else that could have pulled this off. And this was a very early role for him. I don't recall if this was his first ever film role. At the very least, it was his first ever starring role. And I think he may have been only 27 at the time that this came out. Absolutely wild of a star-making performance for sure. And of course, would not go on to win the Oscar this year. But I don't know. I can't really say too much bad about that because I do love Gregory Peck's performance in To Kill a Mockingbird as well.
Sure, same.
I don't know if it's better, but I just love that movie. But at the same time, I can't disregard or at least ignore that this is the more challenging performance. This is the more challenging movie for sure.
I agree. And I think that's what struck me the most on this rewatch, because again, the cinematography, the craft of the film, it is excellent.
Yeah.
It has been essayed to death. And I don't know if I have really much more to add other than the imagery as not just a mechanism for the visual language of the film, but how it complements the storytelling. It is incredible. It's absolutely incredible. And the first time you watch the film, that will stand out. No doubt about it.
Yeah.
on this rewatch, I think because I knew what I was getting into, I really wanted to focus on Peter O'Toole's performance and the characterization of Lawrence. And it really did strike me, the sophistication of this film, as I mentioned earlier. And I love how the film deconstructs him as we go, beginning with, emulating how, in those opening scenes, how he is this idealist. He's this intellectual. He is defined by his belief of mind over matter. There's a couple of tricks he pulls off regarding these matches and putting them out with his fingers.
Match cut. That match cut. Yeah. Quite literally a match cut.
Quite literally, yeah. One of the characters going, yeah, but it hurts. And he just says the trick is not minding that it hurts. And that is important because he doesn't see the desert as the largest landscape that it is. He sees it as something to extinguish. And it does come easy for him at first. Those sequences with his guide are endearing, and Lawrence is able to build a trust with him. But things change quickly once they get to the well, and he realizes that there are laws and principles in the desert that he was ignorant to. And as a result, his guide is killed when he goes for the gun that Lawrence had gifted him in earnest. It's a bit of irony that also works as extraordinary foreshadowing. That moment is also fascinating because, as we learn, Lawrence has an interesting relationship with death and fate. He doesn't like killing and bloodshed. In fact, as his guide is murdered, what he says there is, none of my friends are murderers, which is why he doesn't go off there with Ali. And he's a man of compassion and mercy. That's what we see early on, which is particularly highlighted by his empathy toward the two orphan kids that want to serve him.
Yeah.
But there's the memorable scene of him going back into the desert to find Gassim, who had fallen off his camel and who would have died without Lawrence's heroic actions. The film then goes on to, of course, deconstruct that as his savior complex begins to manifest itself, and he becomes the image of barbarity that he once condemned, even admitting in one scene that he kind of enjoyed.
I was going to bring that up. Yeah, this is a man that did not, he had no experience in killing. So when he finally had the experience, it was almost like this weird awakening for him. This de-evolution of sorts.
I agree. And you couple that with this perspective of Lawrence tempting death in the risk that he takes, such as crossing the Nefud Desert in the first half of the film, or with how he leads his men recklessly into battle in the second half. He's not directly killing by making those decisions, but it says something about him that he's willing to tempt fate in that way. He sees himself as some sort of miracle worker who can do the impossible. And it's because he doesn't see fate as something that is written. There's this vital debate right before he goes out to save Gassim, where he argues that nothing is written. You can write your own fate, something that once again offers incredible irony as the story unfolds, given what we see with Gassim. But it makes sense of his choices throughout the film. I love how the film explores that relationship with death and fate, and how there is a twist on that with Lawrence throughout the film. And the juxtaposition of him as some sort of savior and what that is supposed to mean, what that literally means, yet every action he takes undermines that very definition.
Yeah, like the fact that he was really shaping his own destiny, but what he ended up shaping it into was maybe not what he ever had in mind. And there's a lot of irony to that whole statement that nothing is written. So he's not wrong, but he's also not really right either. He had control over it until he didn't have control over it. And I think that's what makes his arc so fascinating, because it's certainly deconstructing the whole savior complex that you're talking about, that many movies are guilty of portraying, perhaps wrongfully. But the film also does a great job deconstructing audience expectations. And I don't know if this was on David Lean's mind when he was making the film. It may have been, because from what I understand, T.E. Lawrence's real life brother, I think, was alive during the production of this movie and actually didn't approve of the direction this movie was going in. So David Lean,
I can't imagine why.
I know, right? So David Lean clearly knew where he wanted to take this story and the arc he had in mind for T.E. Lawrence.
Mhm.
But I do wonder if he also had it in his mind to play with audience expectations, because we're introduced to T.E. Lawrence in the beginning, and some of his trademark traits are not really ever forgotten or lost throughout the duration of this movie. He's very arrogant. He's very reckless, sometimes to a fault. But at first, as an audience member, you're kind of charmed by that arrogance because it's very playful in a way that you just find endearing and you want to watch. But then when you get to that second half, he still maintains some of that arrogance, but it just has a very different aura this time around. And as an audience member, you're kind of sitting there thinking, man, I was cheering this on just 3 hours ago. What happened?
Yeah.
And it plays with audience expectations as well. And I do wonder if that was on David Lean's mind, but it's certainly there in Peter O'Toole's performance.
I completely agree, but I do think there's a lot of purpose and intention to how David Lean deconstructs that in Lawrence, particularly as it relates to mind over matter, how that is established in the character, as we were talking about a moment ago. And it's interesting how fate and death connect to Lawrence's ethos of mind over matter. His decision to cross the Nefu Desert is almost entirely based on that idea. And the success of finding Gasm, while it reaffirms his belief that his mind can overcome fate, that actually becomes a mechanism for his downfall, because now he thinks he can tame the desert. But fate has a trick up its sleeve when Lawrence commits to being a mediator between two Arab tribes, and one man kills another, and then he is forced to execute the murderer of one of the tribes. And who does that end up being? It ends up being Gasm, the man he saved in the desert. So as much as he thought he could overcome fate, it turns out the desert is not that easy. And if that wasn't enough, later on in the film, as we noted earlier, he admits to enjoying that execution, which at that point, he's in full identity crisis mode, where he likes what he hates and hates that he likes it, meaning that he's lost all control over mind over matter. The psychological nuances of Lawrence there is nothing short of sublime. And I also love how all of that is symbolically depicted when he shows back up in Cairo, not in his British uniform, but in a completely new garb that makes him unrecognizable to his colleagues and commanders. Again, the storytelling and the visual language of the film.
Oh yeah, they mistaken him for an Arab at one point.
Exactly.
Yeah,
I love that about this film. That idea of mind over matter, how that becomes the nucleus of his choices, how he thinks he has one up on the desert, only for the desert to remind him, no, I'm the one in control here.
Well, yeah.
And you don't have the strength. You think that you do, but you don't. And how that breaks him very literally.
Well, yeah,
at one point in the back half of the film is incredible.
Yeah, and by that point, nothing he's doing is at the service of the British government anymore, or even really the Allied powers at large. The British government and the and the Arabs being allies in this example against the Central Powers, which include the Ottoman Empire or the Turks in this case. Nothing is at the service of what they're asking of him. It's all at the service of his desire to tame the desert, as you say, because at some point by the end of the film, it becomes kind of this competition between two allied powers because of T.E. Lawrence's efforts. Really, like the whole journey of trying to overtake Damascus, I believe it is, becomes this race between both the Arabs and the Brits, who are supposed to be allies in this case, which I think also plays into some of the fragmented politics of World War I, which I think is a really interesting idea, that even though they are technically allies, that still doesn't mean that the culture that's technically more strong by numbers is going to look at this next nation as someone that they see as their equal. So there is still this kind of cultural ignorance at play here, even despite the fact that they are part of the same team. So there is that conversation to be had as well. But everything that T.E. Lawrence is doing here is for the betterment of his own ego, essentially. And
Yes.
I think that's really fascinating.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating as well, because initially, I do think his idealism comes from a sincere place.
At first, yeah.
And how the desert begins to break him, again, the irony of mind over matter, I think is interesting. And then to your point, as we see the film deconstruct him further, you enter in the Bentley character, this American journalist. And what does he want to do? He wants to play on that ego even further, because he wants to turn Lawrence into a myth. And when Bentley is around,
that's the thing that has aged the best about this movie, is probably that character.
Yeah, and when Bentley is around, it's almost as if Lawrence is untouchable. You think about the train sequence, especially.
He's almost posing for the camera at that point.
Yes, he is. They blow up the train. One Turk has several clear shots at Lawrence that never hit him, but he doesn't move. He just stands there. He even says brazenly that they could only kill him with a quote-unquote golden bullet. He begins to believe in the myth himself, which is perhaps most quintessential when he proposes to attack the Turkish city of Daraa with just a handful of Arab soldiers. It's another crossroad of mind versus fate, as Ali argues once again that it's suicide, to which Lawrence says, "What do you know about what can be done?" And he believes that he can walk on water because he's pulled off miracles before, but he becomes so out of touch with reality and steeped in illusion that he thinks he can pass as an Arab as he myopically walks out in the open in Turkish occupied territory. "I'm invisible," I believe is what he says.
He even pretends to walk on water, if I'm not
Yes,
mistaken.
and he literally pretends to walk on water. And boy, does that illusion come down to earth quickly when he is captured and tortured.
Pretty much instantaneously. He's not even able to make it like 5 feet until it's like, oh, who is this guy?
Does not get very far. Does not get very far at all. And at that point, he's no longer a myth. He's no longer a savior. He's just a pile of flesh and bone. And he is broken of mind and spirit. And again, like that whole series of events, I just find is so incredible in this movie. It's so good.
It's deeply cynical, and I find that really interesting for a film that came out in 1962. But it never loses its emotional core, which is really good about it. I think if it weren't for one particular thing, this movie may have ended up becoming too cynical for its own good. But thankfully, we still have a performance from Omar Sharif playing Sharif Ali, who maintains that emotional core that's necessary for this film to have really its rewatchability. Otherwise, it would just be too bitter, I feel like. And I think he's able to balance the de-evolution that T.E. Lawrence is going through. And I think that makes that performance so crucial as well. Also nominated for an Oscar, if I'm not mistaken, for this movie. Did he end up winning? I don't have the list of 7 Oscars this movie won in front of me. Let me pull that up quickly. But because it obviously won Best Picture. No, Omar Sharif was only nominated, but did not win Best Supporting Actor for this. But that's unfortunate, because I think in many ways he's sort of the emotional core, or at least he's the one that sustains the emotional core for this movie.
No, yeah, he's really great. And you need a character like that to understand the extremes of where Lawrence
to balance things out. Yeah.
To balance things out, because not only does he understand the political nuances of the region more, he understands the physical costs of going into battle or crossing the desert more than Lawrence does. And I think through that juxtaposition, you really come to realize, and maybe this is a bit ironic or perhaps even funny, given that debate of fate versus death, how you write your own fate. I think the Ali character serves a great purpose, not just emotionally, but I think we do come to understand that the savior complex that manifests in Lawrence, I think so much of it is by sheer luck. By sheer luck.
I don't disagree. I don't disagree. There's a lot that's a lucky accident.
That's a lucky accident, but because those things happen, and maybe that is Lawrence's point after all, is that he's able to create his own luck. That could be part of it, but I think the grounded pragmatism of Ali does demonstrate that a lot of what happens to Lawrence, especially when you go back to that moment, the train sequence we just mentioned a moment ago, he is just standing there as a Turkish soldier is just shooting at him. And he doesn't get hit. He's just standing there. That, again, is the luck factor at play. Any one of those bullets could have struck him. Movie's over. You know?
It is.
So, like, it's
so
one of those things
so
where...
bitter. Wow. I love that.
He's so extreme. Like, he's so disillusioned. And you need a character like Ali that brings everything down to earth. And I think that does give weight to those scenes when he is being tortured, and even it's inferred that he was perhaps raped in those scenes as well. And it gives understanding to why Lawrence becomes as broken as he does and decides to go back to Jerusalem, to British occupied Jerusalem. And when we see him there, he's no longer in his Arab garb. He's back in his British uniform.
Even though it's a borrowed
one.
Yeah, a borrowed one. I was just going to say it's not his, but it is. You know, he is still kind of playing the part, if you will, which is why I said earlier, this is a man that really belonged nowhere in many ways. He was kind of this loner, and I think that seniority complex that we keep alluding to really does come from this need to belong somewhere. And this is someone that just given his participation, given his belief system, he really didn't belong in either world that's at play here. And I find that devastating, but I also find it frightening and so bitter the way that he handles it. And I don't know what Peter O'Toole's able to do with his eyes, because he's able to look at he's able to look straight at the it's all in the eyes, right? He's able to look straight in the camera in that first half, and you are charmed by it. And then he's able to do the exact same thing, and somehow you have nightmares from it in the second half.
Yeah.
I don't know what he does.
Well, and that's the incredible thing about his performance. And I wholly agree with you. Those early scenes, the idealism that he offers to the character, it comes off genuine because of his performance, how he's able to deliver those lines of dialogue, to your point, the way he's able to, with his eye work, with his facial mannerisms, you do believe him. And then through the middle sections of the film, you see him become lost because his identity, has become fractured. And then you get to the third act of the film where there is no ambiguity anymore. Lawrence becomes fully indulgent in his bloodlust. All of his idealism, all of his idealist foundations have evaporated. The desert has completely claimed his mind and body, and he wholly gives into the joy of killing and showing no mercy, crystallizing in a moment. And I love this, again, going back to the visual storytelling of the film, it crystallizes in this moment of Lawrence covered in sand and blood, looking at the reflection on the knife that he was giving, a fascinating shot that juxtaposes one earlier in the film when he was first given those robes and that knife. It's an incredible inverse there, which is to say, you cannot tame the desert. You cannot become the savior of something that was never yours to begin with. The ideal Lawrence is completely gone at that point, other than the myth that exists outside of him, which is why this story has the epic quality it does, because he lives on as a myth.
He does, yeah.
And I love how that plays into the film here.
Yeah, and it's also why the cinematography is so important in emphasizing the vastness of the desert and how untamable that it is, to your point. And as we're talking about here, cinematography by Freddie Young. We have to highlight the individual there, just given how beautiful that this film is and how vast and wide and huge that everything is. It makes it feel very uninhabitable, essentially. Not just untamable, it's uninhabitable. It feels like another planet. It feels like Arrakis is basically what this feels like.
It does.
It's spicing things up, quite literally. We'll probably talk about some individual shots that we love, just in keeping with the theme of this entire episode. But the overall cinematography, I think, definitely has a purpose in emphasizing the bigness and how untamable that it ultimately is.
Yeah, and also shout out to Ann Coates, the editor of this film, because this is a film that is 220 minutes long. It is not a short film by any stretch of the imagination, but it is endlessly fascinating. There is never a banal moment here. And I think her editing, coupled with Freddie Young's cinematography, the writing of the film, the performances, everything we've been talking about, it is an incredibly seamless experience.
If you do plan on watching this movie and you haven't seen it before, I don't recommend watching it on Max. It's available for streaming on Max right now, and I'm not sure how you watched it, JD, at least for the purposes of this particular episode, but the version on Max that I revisited did not include the intermission, nor did it include the opening overture, which I think is so crucial to the overall pacing of this movie and why it works in totality. And I wanted to bring that up because you're talking about the editing. I think Ann Coates' work does play a part into how the film is structured and where those overtures and intermissions are ultimately placed. I think that is very important.
It is interesting you bring that up, because that is also how I watched this movie. Now, thankfully, I had seen it before. So when we got to that element of the film and I noticed that it was gone, I was like, what the hell is going on here?
I was the same way.
I was so confused at first. But if you've seen the film, you'll notice it immediately. And those elements missing here are vital. I agree. That was a bit weird. Thankfully, I had seen the film before, so it didn't really disrupt my experience a whole lot. But
same.
Yeah, that is a good point. If you've never seen it, be aware that if you go to watch this on Max, you're not going to get the whole thing.
Yeah.
And you should go seek out the whole thing.
You should get the whole thing. You absolutely need the whole thing.
I do want to point out, as we wind down this conversation, the marriage of storytelling and visual, in the visual language of the film. That sequence when he goes back to Jerusalem after being tortured. And we noted earlier that he's back in his British uniform. As that sequence plays out, there comes a moment when Lawrence learns of the Sykes-Picot agreement. And his reaction to that is interesting because it's like the British have reopened his wounds. He feels betrayed when he finds that out. And I love how the film visually depicts that by showing us that his wounds on his back have literally reopened and he's bleeding through his uniform. So again, an incredible moment of symbolism there that I did not notice the first time around, but definitely saw it on this second watch.
Very appropriate,
which I thought was incredible. And I think that's the beauty of this film, especially at 222 minutes. You're not going to catch everything the first time around, the second time, or the third time. Like, the more you rewatch this, the more you're going to get out of it, which is why it's so breathtaking. And
absolutely, it's also a very well written film too. Watching it again, I almost found myself jotting down quotes from the movie because I just thought it was so poetically written. Robert Bolt and Michael Wilson, co-writers on this movie, really great stuff there as far as their interpretation of this story. and just the poetry of it as well, I think is really great.
I found this incredibly poetic. I mean, going back to my opening thoughts on this film in this conversation, I find the craft of this film as striking as everyone else does. But on this specific revisit, I found so much in the writing and in the deconstruction of Lawrence as we're talking about. And as we noted earlier, this savior complex isn't anything new by any stretch of the imagination, but the way it's executed here, I think there's a level of sophistication that's just as extraordinary as the filmmaking. It is incredible, the use of symbolism, the dialogue itself, and how the film goes about deconstructing Lawrence in all the ways that we've talked about in this conversation. I find it tantalizing. I was just as engaged, if not more engaged, with the drama, the storytelling, the characterization of Lawrence. And you're right. I mean, it does get a bit cynical in the end. It is a tragedy after all. And I find that fascinating. Like, I find that really, really compelling. In fact, I think there's so much nuance and texture here. There's a lot more the film could have gone into, and I think wonderfully concise, made everything concise for, so there's not
a
much
weird
fat
word,
on this
a
film.
weird word to use for a movie that's almost 5 hours long is to say it's concise, but it is, you're right. There's no wasted space.
And the reason I say that, going back to your Dune comparison, because I think if you were going to remake this film today, I think you could do it in 3 parts, similar to Dune. I think there's so much in terms of the politics, like the context of the setting here, World War I. This film doesn't get into that a whole lot. And when it does, it's in small bursts, small bits in between.
It gives you enough to understand the psychology of the politics, but not the politics of the politics, if that makes sense. It's less interested in that.
I completely agree, which is to say, if you wanted to tell this in 3 parts like Denis Villeneuve is doing with Dune, there is enough material here to do that.
Sure.
Because this film leaves out a lot. There's so much more context you could get into. You could extend sequences that further unravel the psychology of Lawrence. You could extend certain battle scenes, allow more scenes to breathe or to shape into something a little different. There is room to do that here. And I would find that utterly engrossing. But that's why, in addition to the cinematography, I wanted to highlight Ann Coates, because she takes what could have been 3 movies, and she condensed it into
and it somehow makes sense.
222 minutes, and it's very seamless and it makes sense.
Yeah.
So like it's an incredible piece of art. Short of it, that's it.
It's one of the best picture winners of all time. I think many people would agree with that. I think it's, this series is on a roll so far. We've talked about The Apartment, West Side Story, and now this. All 3 are bangers. In their own way, all 3 are bangers. I think Lawrence of Arabia is certainly the best, maybe the most important, to say the least. I do love The Apartment. That might be the one I slightly prefer, as just more of a Brendan pick, if that makes sense. But Lawrence of Arabia is Lawrence of Arabia. There's nothing that compares to it. It's in a way, like, as far as movies are concerned, it's basically Jesus. In a way, it's the best way I could describe it.
Yeah, I mean, Lawrence of Arabia, spoiler alert, will be the best of the 60s that we cover, unless I'm blown away by Tom Jones. I haven't seen it, but who knows? Maybe I'll be blown away.
I haven't seen it either. I haven't seen it either. Some of these I haven't seen in a long time, like The Sound of Music or In the Heat of the Night. Midnight Cowboy I remember loving quite a bit. So I don't think that'll give Lawrence of Arabia a run for its money. I wouldn't be surprised if at the end of the day, both Lawrence of Arabia and The Apartment are my numbers 1 and number 2 respectively when it comes to this.
And I said that a few weeks ago when we reviewed The Apartment. I think those would be my 2, and I still stick to that unless I am surprised. Those will be my 2 when we get done with the 1960s. But I love West Side Story. That's very much up there. Midnight Cowboy, I absolutely love as well. And I'll be happy to revisit In the Heat of the Night. It's been quite a long time. Sound of Music, same thing. Haven't seen that in a while. So I am still excited to see where the rest of this goes. And I haven't done the exercise yet, but I'll bring it up here as a simple talking point. It might be the best of the 2 decades that we've decided to cover so far in the series.
Oh, between the 40s and the 60s. Yeah, let me double check
Casablanca is my number 1 of the 40s.
Same.
So it would come down to Casablanca and Lawrence of Arabia as far as my favorite of this series so far that we've covered. They're both great though. They're both really, really great.
And now we're just splitting masterful hairs here.
You're exactly. I mean, flip a coin, I guess. But
so for now for the year 1962, have you seen the 5 movies nominated for Best Picture, including Lawrence of Arabia, or did you still have some blind spots there?
Haven't seen them all. So To Kill a Mockingbird, of course. I have seen The Longest Day, although it's been the longest day since I've seen that film.
Nice one.
The other 2, I believe, are blind spots for me.
I'm the same way as you. Those are the same 3 that I've seen. I do love To Kill a Mockingbird. That has always been one of my favorite films. I can't say it's better than Lawrence of Arabia, even if it might be the one that perhaps moves me more as a piece of as a piece of storytelling, if that makes sense. It's just something it's a story I've always had a close relationship with, just given the fact that I've always loved the book. So I've always loved the story in general. But Lawrence of Arabia is the better movie. And even if I did, at the end of the day, prefer To Kill a Mockingbird, I still think the Academy got it right. A movie like Lawrence of Arabia needs to have this type of reputation because it needs to serve a point. It needs to serve this type of historical purpose.
Yeah, and nothing against To Kill a Mockingbird. I love it as well. I feel like if that film came out in the 80s, it easily would have won. But I'm excited that for all of its progressive values, and I really love To Kill a Mockingbird, I do love that the Academy awarded the Oppenheimer of its time.
Oh, it's a much bolder movie as well. Like To Kill a Mockingbird is the simpler version of something that could be more complex. But you're right. This was the Oppenheimer of its year for sure.
Yes.
It's a great way to put it, actually.
I love that they stuck to their convictions in that way. And look, I wouldn't have I wouldn't have cared if To Kill a Mockingbird won Best Picture. It is really great, but I do think the Academy got it right between those 2. Yeah. And
have you seen most of David Lean's directorial efforts?
No, there's some blind spots there.
I have quite a few blind spots.
I've seen all the big ones. So Brief Encounter, Great Expectations, The Bridge on the River Kwai, I actually watched last year on my cruise for some reason. I don't know.
That's a very interesting choice for a cruise ride.
I know. I don't know why. It just was right there. I downloaded it and watched it on the cruise.
Okay.
Lawrence of Arabia, Dr. Zhivago. A Passage of to India I have not seen, but after Ryan and Jay's conversation, I don't know if I should stay away or if it made me more
intrigued. I'm kind of curious on it now. I mean, it kind of gets back into maybe like the Alec Guinness conversation we haven't had yet on Lawrence of Arabia, and maybe
that is a good point. The one criticism you will have of Lawrence of Arabia, and it's similar to what we talked about last week with West Side Story. And it's, look, I'm not excusing it. It's, you can't overlook it. It is a problem, but it was a problem of the time.
It was more it was more of a problem with historical epics, and it seems to sometimes still be a problem with historical epics. I don't know if it's just due to the circumstances with how those movies are made that we see that happen more often. So I don't know, but it is it is certainly a problem. It is admittedly a bit distracting because I also feel like Alec Guinness is kind of channeling his early Obi-Wan Kenobi-isms.
There is
with
a little bit of that in his performance.
Because Alec Guinness is a versatile actor. I mean, he has a part in The Bridge on the River Kwai, and it's a very different performance. He's also very funny in the Lady Killers as well. But here, like, I got a lot of Kenobi out of him here. And it was admittedly a bit distracting, which is not really the film's fault or even Alec Guinness's fault. It's more of an, it's our fault, honestly.
Wasn't that partially why he was cast?
I think
Obi-Wan?
so. I think so. Yeah.
This role, I think, had a big influence on Lucas, if I'm not mistaken.
I would not have been surprised, especially given that Tatooine is kind of another mirror image of Arabia here in some ways. So there's definitely an influence happening there.
Yeah, no doubt about it. Next week is going to be interesting though, because I don't think I've seen any of the 5, if I'm being honest. Other than I did watch Cleopatra once, but I was super drunk.
That is a weird. Okay. That's a weird one to get watched drunk.
Well, it wasn't my intent. I was over at a friend's place. There's a lot of us. There was like 20 people over. And for whatever reason, they put on Cleopatra. I don't know why. Could not tell you. But that's what we watched. And can't really tell you a whole lot about.
That's admittedly one I don't think I'm going to try to squeeze in alongside Tom Jones, because Cleopatra is apparently even longer than Lawrence of Arabia.
Yeah, I'm probably not going to give that one a go either.
Yeah.
So I might have seen How the West Was Won. That might have been one I saw with my dad years ago. Mm-hmm. But again, I don't really. I'd have to give it a go to see if it jogs my memory.
There are a lot of long movies from this era. I mean, like Lawrence of Arabia really started to set some type of trend, not just with movies in general, but even David Lean kept trying to recreate the success of Lawrence of Arabia with movies like Dr. Zhivago or Ryan's Daughter or A Passage to India. And from what I understand, some of these movies I haven't seen. I have seen Dr. Zhivago, and I actually quite like that film from what I remember. But some of these other ones, from what I understand, he was just not able to replicate that success.
Yeah. I mean, Zhivago holds a great reputation.
I like that
At least among critics and cinephiles.
I like that one quite a bit from what I remember. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I don't know. It is interesting. I'm curious if Oppenheimer sets a trend through the rest of the 2020s.
Maybe.
Or maybe not. Who knows? Maybe that'll be a one-off.
I don't know. I don't know, but we'll see.
I mean, audiences of the 60s were built different. They could handle 3-hour epics. Today's culture, no chance. The fact that Oppenheimer garnered $1 billion is a goddamn miracle, for being honest.
Yeah, well, Lawrence of Arabia also did fairly well at the box office at its time too, from what I understand. I think adjusted for inflation, I guess it equates to like 600 million or something like that. It actually did back in the day, which is not too bad for a movie like this. So we'll see if Oppenheimer ends up being more of the Lawrence of Arabia of our time instead of something like Dune, which would be really funny.
I know, crazy. That is wild about Dr. Zhivago. It budget $11 million and then went on to make hundreds of millions of dollars. That's insane. Wow. Yeah, that's incredible. At any rate, Lawrence of Arabia, masterpiece, one of the best films of all time, let alone Best Picture winners. We do love it. If you agree or disagree with anything we had to say, you can leave a comment below. If you're watching on YouTube, you can leave a comment on social media. If you're listening on Apple Podcast or Spotify, be sure to subscribe to the show. As we noted earlier, it really does help us out a lot. Engage with the show any way you can. We really do appreciate your support. As I noted, we do have 2 reviews this week. We have Mickey 17. Look forward to getting into that. And I don't even know how to describe Love Me. It's equally weird. If you've seen Mickey 17, you know it's a bit of a strange one. Love Me, also weird in a very different way.
I'd say there's a good chunk of it where my first thought was, I guess Disney's getting really bold with their live action adaptations, this time for WALL-E.
But that's the thing. Is it live action? Like, 3/4 of it is animated.
It's 3/4 of it. It's so badly animated that I want to talk about why it's so badly animated. Though. It's such a deliberate choice.
It is a deliberate choice. Yeah, it is not the sharp animation you're accustomed to with something like Pixar.
Oh, it looks like 95 like Windows computer game kind of stuff. Yeah,
it is weird. Yeah. I don't know why they chose that. I'll be curious to do some homework on it, but yeah, those two films will be interesting to get into them. So we'll talk about that tomorrow. We'll record them tomorrow, but they'll be out later this week, so you can be on the lookout for that. And then we have Women in Session later on in the week as well. I think there was going to be a Chasing the Gold postmortem episode, but I don't know if that's happening anymore. I'm not really too sure. There might be a little bit of a hiatus as far as Chasing the Gold goes. But there will be a new Women in Session later this week, so you can be on the lookout for that as well. With that, we're going a little long here, so we'll go ahead and end it. But we hope everyone is enjoying the Best Picture movie series. Again, thanks to everyone for your support on the After Sun essay adventure. That was a lot of fun. I hope people go and check out that article. It was a lot of fun to write. So I do hope that you enjoy it. And with that, I will be back for next week's main show, but I'll be gone for the reviews next week as I'm going to be going to Disney this weekend. My son turns 2.
Oh, that's cute. That's
weekend.
cute. Taking him to Disney. I love that.
Yeah, love it. All right. Well, with all that said, thanks for listening, everybody. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time on the InSession Film Podcast. Oh, Peter O'Toole. Those eyes.
Things have
Those eyes will
small
get you.
beginnings.